order, and a very warm welcome to this 8th inquiry session for the Pensioner Poverty Inquiry. And it's an absolute pleasure to welcome Anthony Pygram, Peter Smith and Simon Francis. Lovely to see you all. Perhaps we could start with introductions and in terms of the organisations you represent, starting with Simon.
Yeah, so I'm the co-ordinator of the End Fuel Poverty Coalition, which is made up over 100 charities, campaign groups, some local authorities, and supported by academics campaigning to end fuel poverty.
I'm Peter Smith. I'm Director of Policy and Advocacy at the charity National Energy Action. We're a fuel poverty charity that works across most of the UK, but we work closely with our sister organisation, Energy Action Scotland.
And good morning, I'm Anthony Pygram. So I'm a member of the Committee on Fuel Poverty, which is an advisory, non-departmental public body advising on the effectiveness of policies aimed at reducing fuel poverty and encouraging greater coordination across organisations working to reduce fuel poverty. Our remit is England, with fuel poverty being a devolved matter.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And as I say, a very warm welcome to you. I'm going to kick off and then we will got some questions for you. So I wonder if you can explain how pensioners in fuel poverty have managed over this winter and what we expect to see that may be different for the winter for this year. Should we start with Sam?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we've seen, and you've heard evidence already from charities that have painted a very bleak picture of how pensioners have suffered. And I think, you know, what we would sort of highlight is, the research from Age UK showing that 35% of pensioners earning under 20k said their home was cold most or all of the time. And I think one of the things that we sort of always talk about in fuel poverty is just how hidden sometimes this is, and that pensioners in particular are very bad at coming forward and admitting that they are struggling. You could even to their own relatives, you can imagine a situation where a pensioner will put on the heating when their family comes round to make it look like nothing's a problem when actually it is. And what we're concerned about is obviously the health impacts of that. MedAct, the health campaign charity, found that 75% of frontline health workers see housing-related illness regularly. 45% of frontline health workers have discharged patients into housing that they know will make them ill again. And that is, obviously staggering that health professionals are having to do that. In terms of the impact, what we've seen, obviously it's difficult to sort of look at the health data, and we would encourage the ONS, Department of Health and others to sort of actually report more regularly on the health impacts of people living in cold, damp homes, having much greater awareness of sort of admissions data. But certainly we've seen over winter 2024-25 compared to winter 2023-24, there was an increase in the number of deaths amongst the whole population. If you look at the ONS data for December, January and February. So there was an increase amongst the whole population, but there was a much greater increase in the number of deaths amongst those aged 75 and above. So a total of 3,359 additional deaths amongst 75 plus year olds one winter compared to the last. And that was despite average temperatures not dropping below what we would normally see as being dangerous levels. And if you look at the energy prices, actually for the average household, energy prices were 10% lower this winter than they were last winter. But even incorporating sort of what might be considered trend data, you're probably looking at around 650 pensioners who died over and above additional trends for those who are age 75 plus. So that's the impact. And when you look at everything else, you think, well, what else changed? The only thing really that was different was for some pensioners, they were paying more for their energy than and their energy bills were higher than they've ever seen in their lives. And what we see is people self-disconnecting, living in cold, damp homes, suffering as a result of that. And ultimately, the figures show that there was an increase in the number of people who sadly died last winter.
Thank you, Simon. Peter, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, thank you. I'd agree with a lot of those observations, and tragic as they are. I think as an advice provider, National Energy Action have had direct contact with hundreds of pensioners over the course of this winter. Pretty much a familiar story in terms of impacts on physical health, but also mental health impacts. The typical trend has been, and I think this is supported by some of the data that you're publishing today, has been to ration their energy use, often to the point where it becomes dangerous for people's health and well-being. That's energy rationing, sadly, is endemic. We did some polling in March with YouGov, which suggested that 50% of households across the population, adult population GB at least, are considering or have considered turning down their energy beyond the point at which they would like to. And we know those impacts are tragic not only to those individuals but also to our health services, and it puts a massive pressure on already stretched public services at a critical time of year.
Thank you, Peter. Anthony.
Thank you. So I think the key thing to remember here is that energy prices are a lot higher than they used to be. They're about 1.5 times what they were before the gas crisis with the Ukraine conflict. The price cap will go down slightly probably in the next week or so, but you are still talking several £100 more than it used to be. And as others have said, the way pensioners react to that, probably more than other demographics, is not to use energy to save money. They don't like being in debt. There's research that shows very few of them think they're in arrears to their energy supply. They avoid that. So you get the health disbenefits and the health problems that we're seeing. The price cap is, energy prices aren't going to go down anytime soon. This is going to be an enduring problem, I think.
Okay, thank you. So, can I invite comments again, as brief as you're able, specifically on the government's steps to reduce energy costs and improve energy efficiency. When do you think that is realistically likely to take effect and make a difference in terms of the costs that people have to pay for their energy?
Well, I think ultimately we don't know, because we don't know how much the government is planning on investing in the Warm Homes Plan. Obviously, we've heard the figure of 13.2 billion is what was promised in the manifesto. Obviously, there's been rumours in the FT and Politico that is under some threat and scrutiny. And if we don't get the full funding going into helping people, then the energy efficiency measures won't be delivered, and people will ultimately end up having to continue to pay more for their energy.
Well, in a welcome way, energy efficiency measures are already delivering huge benefits, and they've offset for the beneficiaries some of the worst impacts of this energy crisis and the sort of prolonged impacts since. I think whether or not that trend could be sustained, and in particular whether or not sort of future efforts are going to be sufficient to meet our statutory targets on fuel poverty is very much bound up in the conversation that Simon was starting about the spending review. But we are hopeful that action's being taken in the private rented sector, and that there are coherent plans coming forward within government. But obviously we're really kind of anxious and keen to see the detail.
Anthony?
The best way to reduce levels of fuel poverty is to have houses which are well wrapped, so that you don't use as much energy. We've seen a long and steady decline in fuel poverty due to improvements in energy efficiency, but over the last 5 years, 2019 to 2024, that's flatlined, basically. So we're not seeing that change very much. So we'll be looking forward to seeing what the government's review on the fuel poverty strategy, its review of the minimum energy efficiency standards in the private rented sector, and the Warm Home Plans do in order to regain momentum here.
Thank you. Sticking with you, Anthony, if I may. Your committee said last year that targeted support would remain important and necessary for the foreseeable future. What do you mean and why? And what would need to happen to change that assessment?
Yeah, so thank you. The average gap between affordable bills for those in, and what they have for those in fuel poverty is around £400 a year. That's across the population of people in fuel poverty. It fell slightly in 2024, but consumers are still carrying about £3 billion of debt. Either we reduce the amount of energy people use by stepping up energy efficiency, the rate of home insulation to cut bills, and or reduce the price of energy, or we find mechanisms to boost their income so they can afford the extra amount that they have to pay. There's no indication that energy prices are going down over the next few years. Moves to net zero, if anything, will keep them high, potentially raise them further. So until everyone has a well-wrapped house and can use less energy and or has higher income, you are going to see this continuing problem. As I say, energy efficiency measures have pretty much flatlined. That's why we think it's going to go on for a while yet.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else want to comment on that, or can I move on?
On bill support,
Yeah.
on the future of bill support, I do think it's important to stress the preference towards direct support to reduce energy bills. I think we talked about the tendency for pensioners in particular to ration their energy use, and sadly energy is one of those things that gets sort of traded out in the household budget. So unless there's direct support to directly reduce bills, often if you provide people with cash supplements, they're going to spend that on servicing debts, other essentials like food, and it's unlikely to go on the energy bill. So I think it's vital that any support is available does go directly off energy bills, and there are the mechanisms to do that.
Sticking on that point, and we can bring in others as well, to what extent do we currently have an effective and coherent package of support that's targeted for those that are in fuel poverty, particularly our pensioners?
Well, I think there's a lot of schemes out there, and I think that's one of the things that I think we probably all kind of not just amongst charities but wider agree on, is that we need to see a kind of a more comprehensive targeted bill support scheme, called the social tariff, which would be a unit rate discount, so that we are helping people who are vulnerable, who are reliant on this. And I think we need to remember as well that just when we're talking about the definitions of fuel poverty, that the government definition at the moment is narrow and is being consulted on, but figures from Jonathan Bradshaw and University of York show that around 3.2 million pensioner households are likely to be really struggling with their energy bills, and 964,000 pensioner households are in deep fuel poverty, which means they're paying more than 20% of their household income just on energy. And that's not taking into consideration the fact that people are cutting back, so should be actually spending more potentially in order to keep themselves warm. So I think we need to see this kind of a rounded approach to providing support for people in fuel poverty. Okay.
I would say that there is clear actions which look to target the main drivers of fuel poverty. So if you look at incomes, there's obviously we're talking quite a lot today about the cold weather payments, winter fuel payments. There's also cold weather payments, but they haven't gone up since they were sort of first introduced almost. On prices, there's the warm home discount scheme, but that's only been increased by £10 in the last decade, when energy prices, I think, since the 1st of April 21 have gone up about £700. And then on energy efficiency, sadly, those resources aren't sufficient to meet the statutory requirements, which are very clear in law. So there are the elements of a plan and actions and programmes that can tackle the main drivers, but they're just not sufficient for the job at hand, particularly given the aftermath of the energy crisis.
What would you like to see in addition, Anthony? Do you want to kick off with that?
It's not terribly well targeted. It's part of the problem we have here. So until last winter, the winter fuel payment went to all pensioners, irrespective of whether they needed it. Actually, what you needed is the people who need it to get more, because if you've got a fuel poverty gap of over £400 in rural areas, over £700, getting £200 will help, but it won't solve things. Energy efficiency schemes, the hit rate for energy efficiency schemes is typically less than 50%, so less than 50% of the recipients are actually the people it's aimed at. So better targeting, for me, is absolutely key here.
Any other final comments before I move on?
I think one thing that we'll probably touch on later on, but it is worth saying now, is automation is also really important, particularly when we're dealing with income-related support or support that can take money off bills. The more that can be auto-enrolled and done without households opting in, the better. We know that particularly in the pensioner population, that presents a lot of challenges to give people the confidence and the confidence to come forward and claim that support. We've seen that generally in terms of the push on pension credit, where a lot has been effort has been put in, particularly recently, to try and get pensioners to come forward with what is a very generous package of support if you were to receive pension credit. But there are sort of cultural barriers and unidentified barriers to people coming forward and claiming that support. So the more that we can do to automatically enrol people, the better.
Thank you. Right, John Milne.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. Focusing in particular on winter fuel payment, which is back in the news if it ever fully left it. What do you feel the impact has been of the decision to drastically reduce access? Simon, if you want to start.
Well, I think I've already mentioned, I'm not going to repeat myself, but yeah, obviously there's been a massive impact, and actually the big difference for pensioners this year opposed to previous years has been the removal of winter fuel payment, and that's what we think has driven quite a lot of the problems that we've seen. And I think that within the decision that was made, and clearly it's not just the decision itself, it was a lack of time that pensioners had to prepare for the decision coming in. It was a lack of consultation that was done with anybody about that decision, and the lack of foresight or warning that any of the charities who work with older people had about being able to then ramp up services to deliver. I know our members spent a lot of time working on the pension credit uptake campaign and helping with that, but that was a huge amount of effort that we need to see repeated almost every year as well. So the other problem that we saw was not just the decision itself, but also what we've sort of talked about is the three problems at the moment are the threshold in terms of it being set too low, the taper, so you have a cliff edge, if you're £1 over on your income, you're not getting any support at all, and the targeting must include disabled pensioners and those who are on non-means tested benefits. And as we've heard, the amount itself, of course, it really, if the amount of the winter fuel payment was keeping track with the rise in energy prices, it should be £550.
I'd agree with a lot of that and the earlier remarks about rationing, but I think uncertainty had prompted a huge amount of uncertainty about people's sort of outgoings, and at a very difficult time. This was a time where not only was there rumours afoot that energy prices were going to surge again, as they did, and we've seen 3 successive price increases since that announcement, and so that backdrop, I think, scared people, and people generally fearful about how they were going to make do. Remember, the last winter came off the back of 3 successive winters of people really, really struggling. All of that sort of financial resilience had sort of ebbed away. People's savings largely had been sort of gone through. So very, very difficult for people. And I think, faced with that, people could only cut back, and that's what we've seen with the consequences that we've outlined.
So the basic idea of targeting is good, but as others have said, there are a lot of people just above that threshold who suffered a lot last winter, and there are perhaps 800,000 people who are eligible for but don't claim for pension credit who lost out. So there's a lot of losers there who you have to worry about.
Sorry, just to come back in very briefly, we had I was reading our living experience library case study on someone who missed out by £2.50 on that, and do you think I think you've had evidence to the committee said £9,000 is the overall quantum of support that you can get if you're eligible to be on pension credit, and someone's missed out on that by £2.50.
As you say, a tremendous cliff edge. In Scotland, government's taken a different course, and they've got a £100 payment, which obviously partially mitigates. Have you seen any? Can you see any contrast or difference between the two countries in impact?
I think obviously that's not yet come in. I think it's still to kind of actually come through. So obviously we'll wait and see, and obviously that will be welcome for those households that did miss out. I think one of the things though also the Scottish Government could have done was look at the Fuel Insecurity Fund, which was very successful during the height of the crisis, and that would have provided support and also make sure that local authorities are equipped. And I think we may come on to the Household Support Fund across and the consequentials there, but I think that's also something that we need to see.
It's not a comment on England or Scotland, but Northern Ireland, we know that the impact there has been very, very bad. There was already endemic levels of fuel poverty in Northern Ireland. Many more households reliant on heating oil, for example, which has fluctuated hugely, or continues to fluctuate hugely. A lot more propensity to prepayment, even for pensioners who typically in GB aren't on prepayment as much. So the impact's been very acute there. And we're very conscious that the support that's being talked about at the moment for this winter, which is very welcome, that the government is setting out at the moment, is reliant on a GB-wide mechanism, the Warm Home Discount Scheme, which doesn't apply in Northern Ireland. So there's a particular gap there that will need to be plugged, and it's a very urgent conversation in Northern Ireland. Their programme of government is very clear that more action needs to be taken in Northern Ireland to tackle fuel poverty, but also they need the support of the UK government.
I won't comment on Scotland, thank you. We're covering with England.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The department chose not to make a full impact assessment prior to this decision. Do you think there's a case for evaluating the impact now for future policy? And if so, what would you expect it to look at? For example, should it include wider impacts such as on health and social care services? And how could it practically do that? Yes. Multiple questions. I'm trying to get.
You want it short?
You can do that in 30 seconds.
No, absolutely. It should do, and it should look at the wider impact across health and social care. Especially, I think let's hear from doctors, frontline health professionals as well about the impacts of this. Let's hear from as well, kind of people who are working on the ground, social workers, and make sure that we get a full picture of what happened. And also, I think they did publish that sort of limited assessment about, it's not going to increase fuel poverty rates all that much, but I think they were looking at the wrong numbers. They were looking at the low income, low energy efficiency measure, and they weren't looking at a more broader income measures, such as the figures that I read out from University of York. So I think, look at the broader picture, don't just look at that tiny definition.
It's a bit trite to say, but better late than never. I think it would be good to have that assessment, but I would like to see one in the round talk about the winter pressures and the impact of cold homes on the whole population, not just necessarily pensioners. I think that there's huge anxiety at the moment about lone parents and the extent to which that they are continue to be struggling the most. And I think it's very important that we look in the round at this picture, not just focus on pensioner population and the impact there of the particular cut to the winter fuel payment. If there was an impact assessment, I would urge that one of the things to look at would be the application of the NICE guidance on cold homes. There's some very, very welcome guidance that was put in place in the middle of last decade by NICE, tackling the impact of cold homes, excess winter deaths. And to see what the extent of the practical application of that had been to offset some of the impact that this situation has caused would be very, very valuable, because I think that whole framework could be hugely valuable, but it needs to be reviewed and updated if it's going to play its full part.
I won't add to what Simon and Peter have said on that. What I would say is what's important is that we don't get into this position again, is that where you have changes proposed which are going to impact pricing and impact to fuel port, there are impact assessments which specifically look at the impact on those who are struggling financially to afford their energy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Steve Darling.
Thank you. So you've already slightly touched on this about the campaign to take up pensioner credit. So I'd welcome some reflections on how effective that has been. Also, trying to help people who are just above that. Has there been much success with that? And then also, do we have the information to analyse this fully, or could there some additional work be done to make sure we've got a clear understanding of where we are on this journey?
Yeah, I think we do need to have much better, this comes into the impact assessment and looking at as well at how we kind of can react more to what happens. So, what we know as well is if you look at kind of previous, kind of winters, when we see the average temperature of a winter going below 4 degrees centigrade, we tend to see a rise in the number of people who are dying as a result of that winter. And I think, we need to sort of have a much bigger kind of a much better grasp of the health data that's coming out of the NHS, so that we can kind of make those assessments. And I think that's where one of the things that we could see is a reform to the cold weather payments. So that's more of an extreme weather payment, and it's paid out in advance of the temperatures dropping, because there's no point, there is point giving a pensioner money after the event, but they're not going to make their decision to turn the heating on based on money they don't have. So I think, making that more proactive, looking at the when that's paid out based on predictions would absolutely help. But I think we need to see much more kind of rapid reporting of data, so we can actually assess what's happening each winter with the health and well-being of our pensioners.
I think It was good. When the campaign did actually mobilise, the sort of above-the-line campaign in terms of the radio advertisements, the work to advertise it in GP surgeries, that was all good things, and it was reaching the right people, but it was just too late. Also, we know that we were herding people towards a sort of ever kind of narrowing corridor in terms of being processed. And those frustrations of the people that have gone through the process and didn't get processed in time, I think that they eventually sorted out the vast majority. I think that caused concern from the agents that are there referring people in, telling people it's worth it. If they don't think they're going to be processed in time, there's a sort of reputational impact. I think also, finally, the role of community groups is vital, particularly where you need multilingual assets to get through to different types of communities and individuals, and other types of engagement techniques which we know are effective rather than just sort of broadcast from government.
So now, actually, there was a point at the start of the campaign where we were sort of herding, as you say, directing people to the portal, but actually the application time was so long that they wouldn't have actually got the winter fuel payment in time for the cut-off. And I think, the resources that need to be put into, if we're going to do this campaign and kind of going to ask community groups and charities to all kind of, make a really concerted effort, there has to be the resources in place to then deal with that effort at the very least.
And let's hope it's not a one-hit wonder. It's just as vital this winter.
Yeah, because every year more pensioners come in. We need to make sure that this happens every year.
Bearing in mind the winter fuel, you've already alluded to that it's only a relatively small sum of money compared to other opportunities in the benefit system. What reflects, how big a part does it have to play of actually tackling fuel poverty? So reflections around that would be really helpful.
Well, it's a chunk of that £700 increase since the 1st of April. If you're getting the upper limit, £300, that's, almost half. So it is significant. But it's obviously not going to offset the full impact of recent rises, let alone tackle the overriding affordability that some households may face. I think its main limiting factor I've mentioned is the fact that it's income support rather than directly off bills. I think if it was directly off bills, the impact of that in terms of warming people's home and the outcome that you want to see of the policy keeping people out of hospital, etc., would be much more guaranteed.
Yeah, I would agree with Peter there. It needs to come directly off bills to be beneficial, to be purely beneficial. It's not being well targeted now. It is more targeted, but it is not enough to make that key difference to help people.
That's really helpful. And also, I don't know if you're aware, Independent Age have asked for a review of levels and how it's applied. Do you have any reflections on their thoughts in that area?
You've got some views on the tapering, haven't you? And the
well, I think we need to. As we've mentioned before, it's the tapering issue that really has to be addressed. I think that within the coalition, there's views on where the pension credit threshold should increase to, as you might expect. But certainly it does need to. We need to see that threshold increase, and I think it's that taper point that just introducing that real cut-off was hugely damaging.
I would say if there is going to be a tapered system, we should resist the temptation to spread the jam. Jam's a horrible way of putting it, but spread the whatever budget there is as thinly as that taper applies to, because the people that are weighted down the lower income deciles will desperately need more support. And so it's right that you approach that in a sort of in a way that's already recognised through the age differential in the policy. It'd be good to see that same approach being weighted depending on income as well.
So in light of those comments, do you disagree with universality?
Not as a principle, but in times of need and in these situations, if you are going to provide support, it's vital that it gets to the people that need it the most. I would argue that we haven't actually done that in this context, but that principle, it's a very good principle, universalism.
Yeah, and it is. I think in some ways risking being slightly offensive to pensioners that we're arguing about, the money and the support that we should be able to give them when, we know that the energy industry as a whole has made, billions and billions of pounds of profit. And, and I appreciate that for suppliers the situation is slightly different, but for the wider energy industry, if you take into account the network firms, the transmission companies, if you look at the market trading firms that are involved in trading our energy, billions and billions of pounds of profits. And I think there has been some suggestions that there needs to be a wider industry contribution to support the support that we can give then to pensioners and others.
And are you able to point to any discussion documents or anything where that has been unpicked a little further that we could reflect on?
Yeah, I can send you some. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Danny Kruger.
Thanks. Well, just following that, and Peter, you were talking about the cold weather payments earlier. What it sounds like, it wouldn't be your preferred way of addressing this problem. Could you just unpack a bit what you think of the scheme? And I mean, bearing in mind we don't need to use the current arrangement, which is pretty clunky and, as you say, hasn't risen much. So, I mean, the Resolution Foundation did some work suggesting a more sophisticated, preemptive, day-by-day way of anticipating cold weather, giving a more universal grant to people. Is that, leaving aside the whole question about energy costs, I recognise is more important in a sense, but if we are trying to target support, would that not be better?
I think cold weather payments have the virtue of scaling with need, obviously, and they are more triggered more frequently in the north where there's more need for them, and so that's good. But I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of needing to move away from it being paid in arrears. We sadly saw situations in November last year where I think it got to the 6th day of freezing cold weather, literally sub-zero, almost minus 18 degrees. And then we had this huge swing to sort of +5, +6. And people have lost that. They didn't get that payment. And so if we're there telling people, well, don't worry, you might get £25 this week, just hold on, you might get it. It's not going to give anybody any confidence, is it? So given AI, given the sophistication of the Met Office these days, it is not beyond the wits of man to pay it in advance. In lieu of that, you could look at the temperature thresholds. Simon alluded to the fact that actually freezing cold weather isn't what kills people more often than not. It's actually more milder weather, so you could look at those temperature thresholds, reduce the amount of days. You could reduce the amount of weather stations. There's a number of things that you could do to that scheme to make it more effective, and to be frank, pay out a little bit more than it would, if you don't make those reforms.
Okay. So what's the point about milder weather being worse than cold weather?
We know physiologically that conditions below 5 degrees start killing people in their homes. And in fact, when there's a freezing cold spell, that's not when you see the excess morbidity, or mortality, sorry. It's actually a couple of weeks after that you see what's called a death spike, which isn't a very nice way of putting it, but that's where you see at a population level excess deaths increase.
So very cold is not particularly more dangerous than just cold.
That's
it's a different
true, but it's whether or not it's sustained or not.
I see. Yeah. I see.
And as well, because as well, that sort of just above freezing tends to then be more damp. So therefore, that's where you get the cold, damp homes problem, which is what then causes the mould and the breathing difficulties and all the rest of it. So it's that contribution.
Yeah. Very few people die of exposure.
Freezing is unpleasant, but I get that. Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. David Pinto-Duchensky.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for sharing your insight. For both winter fuel and cold weather payments, as we've discussed, eligibility is linked to the receipt of means tested benefits. What do you think are the main pros of that, but also the limitations of using benefits as a proxy for fuel payment?
So, low income is a key factor in fuel poverty, clearly. So, in a sense, means testing is means tested benefit is a good starting point. Yeah, but where we struggle is precise targeting of cold homes. So, those living in poorly insulated homes need more support than those living in well-insulated homes. Obviously, it's particularly a challenge for older people in low-cost private rented sector, where landlords have perhaps more limited incentives to insulate. It requires levers to oblige landlords to invest in upgrading their homes, something that's fallen behind in the sector relevant to other housing stock, and that really is a key issue here, because if you're in private rented sector, you have limited ability to affect how much energy you're going to use, because it's not your responsibility to insulate.
I think they only get about half the people that we're really concerned about, maybe just over half. I think 40% of fuel poor households in England, I believe, aren't on means tested benefits, working age typically, and aren't claiming any benefits. So instantly, that's a really vulnerable cohort of people that you aren't supporting. Anthony's absolutely right that also low income, energy costs vary hugely depending on within income deciles. So you might have one household that's living in a hugely energy efficient property in top rated social housing, and then somebody else in the private rented sector that's paying £3,000, £4,000 a year on their energy bills. And given that swing, just relying on means tested benefits without thinking about the energy spend in the house is problematic.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think when we've looked at kind of who should benefit from energy bill support, the public back the principle of giving support to older people, but also people with medical dependence on staying warm, people with respiratory diseases, cardiovascular diseases, financial vulnerabilities. There's a broader group there that aren't captured by means tested benefits.
So look, and this is fascinating. Thank you. I mean, I suppose I take away three things from what you're saying and wanted to test them with you. The first is targeting is a good idea. So not against the idea of targeting per se, but it's what you use to target. And it actually sounds like, Anthony, for instance, not wishing to put words in your mouth at all, but it sounds almost like something to do with the type of housing stock you're in, and the housing tenure is in some ways a more important, it kind of raises a question about whether it should be targeted, for instance, through something that's connected to your housing, we have housing benefit. I suppose the other question I had was, and Peter, you raised a really interesting point, was about the fact that 40% of people in fuel poverty don't receive means tested benefits. Now, obviously, many of them are outside the scope of this inquiry because it's about pensioners. But what is the relative thing of kind of pensioners versus non-pensioners? Are pensioners the main fuel poor group?
I think actually it's probably single parents with children who are the single worst off group in terms of numbers and in terms of level of fuel poverty. But that's not to take away from the fact that there are a lot of pensioners who are struggling.
Right, absolutely. So
about 20%, I think, about 20% of pensioners are in fuel poverty. I think something like that. Sorry, it's 20% of fuel poor population are pensioners.
One in five of the fuel poor are pensioners.
Yeah.
Fine. And obviously, the reason this is important is that we've obviously heard concerns about people who are just above the level of the kind of cliff edge for passported benefits. Really picking up, and therefore miss out. And kind of it's almost to your point, Anthony, that the Venn diagrams don't really, and Peter, that the Venn diagrams don't really overlap. Is there a better way of targeting that, where the state actually has information to target? Because I suppose that is the $64,000 question.
Absolutely, and in a sense, it's the public sector that holds the key here. So energy suppliers know a lot of information about their customers, where they've got smart meters. They can see when somebody's off supply, or they can check in on somebody because they're not using energy. But if you share data between HMRC, DWP, local council tax information, the NHS, and a responsible body brought this all together, that could give you really key information on who is struggling, which households are struggling, in a way that actually we have the data, it's not being used. Now, I've heard over many years concerns about data privacy. Well, sometimes maybe health and well-being need to take priority. And I've heard concerns about data matching. And I would say where there's a will, there's a way. I think actually where there's AI, there's a way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Peter?
I think undoubtedly using HMRC data, health data, where it exists, and can be done in a data sensitive way, data privacy sensitive way, is undoubtedly a very good thing. I just restate the point I made earlier. As long as that is being used to directly enrol people in the support that's on offer, that will be a much more effective route than requiring people to opt into support where we know that there are huge barriers.
The only thing I'd add is obviously, that, also making sure that, energy suppliers are part of that. And as well, looking at meter type, you mentioned the benefits of smart meters, which absolutely could be used to sort of detect whether someone isn't using enough energy. But for those, obviously, who are still on old school meters, and for those, especially who are on prepayment meters, either, if they're in smart mode again, the suppliers do good work in terms of supporting those households, but there's a lot of people on prepayment meters that are not smart, and therefore we don't know whether or not they're topping them up, and I think that should also be a risk factor.
Great, thank you. And then just one final question. This is fascinating, and it also sounds like the companies have a big role to play, not least as kind of providers of data that will give us that integrated picture. But clearly that is a longer term project. And Anthony, you're absolutely right. But the challenge of data integration in government is a very difficult one, and GDPR makes it all the more so. Are there any other short-term things, low-hanging fruit, that DWP or government more broadly can be doing today, so to speak, with acknowledging all the constraints you've outlined, to try to help people now, so to speak?
I come in for that. So I think in the short term, some very welcome work has been done at the moment, looking at those issues about extending the warm home discount scheme to groups that previously had to apply. And that's very welcome and necessary in terms of offsetting some of the impacts of lone working age households, lone parents who should be some of the prime beneficiaries of those steps. That's vital work, not only in the context of providing this additional support this winter, but in an ongoing way when we hopefully clarify the ongoing support that's going to be available to directly offset energy bills. And then the final thing I'd say is that in the Digital Economy Act, there's a set of schedules. In those schedules, it lists a whole number of organisations that are given access to that information. One of those is energy suppliers, but we would like to see local authorities directly having that information so they could better target things like the Household Support Fund, and also energy networks could be provided with that information because they often confront households in vulnerable circumstances right at a crisis point, broken down boiler, gas leak, point of disrepair in terms of some appliance because of neglect. And it would be fantastic if they were then able to refer these people towards support and know that they will get it because they're eligible.
Yes, where somebody in the public sector identifies somebody who is probably in need, having a clear pathway. So, for example, GPs, they will see people in need. They can identify them. If there's a clear pathway to allow them to bring people into the system, that can help. It won't be the whole answer, but it'll help.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Peter Bedford.
Thank you, Chair. Turning to, you've already mentioned the warm homes discount and some other support that there is out there. I just wonder what your views were on a social tariff. I know in the utility sector, particularly the water industry, it's a bit haphazard how it's applied, but there are different levels of social tariffs that different companies apply. What's your view on how that could be applied better to the energy sector?
Well, we have had social tariffs in the past, and then we moved to the sort of consistent policy in the warm home discount scheme. When we had those social tariffs previously, it was a big concern, hugely varied the level of support that was available from different suppliers. Often it wasn't very generous at all for some suppliers, and it didn't trace need at all. We wouldn't want to move back there, and we'd want to sort of evolve, I think, what we've got in terms of the warm home discount scheme to be fit for purpose moving forward. I think the big opportunities for a social tariff are to not only either bag some of the benefits that we've got now with a discount for like the warm home discount scheme, which provides all the support up front, but provide an ongoing reduction in running costs for particularly households on prepayment meters, for example. That would be very welcome. But also, I think this point around the depth of support needs to be grappled with. I mentioned earlier, £150 rebate has only gone up from £140 in 10 years when energy prices have increased by £700 in the last couple of years. So it's this depth of support issue which we're going to need to grapple with. it's very difficult, obviously, at the moment to make that argument to the Treasury, but potentially a hybrid between maybe consumers contributing some money towards this social tariff, as well as the Treasury providing some support, can be brought together in a way which means that we can provide meaningful levels of support for the poorest households. And as Anthony said, give that bridge to them having their house renovated and reducing their exposure to these energy costs in the longer term through energy efficiency measures.
So a social tariff is potentially really important. You can do it by giving a lump sum, or you can do it by essentially having cheaper energy, cheaper unit rate, cheaper standing charge, whatever. Probably the advantage of the latter might be that at a time when you need energy, you're paying less for it. And for those who are poorer, they're more likely to be on prepayment meters or paying on receipt of a bill. They will get the reduction exactly when they need it. So that there are advantages either way, but the key thing is they get it at the time they need it, and they get a meaningful reduction.
We recently had an evidence session in Cardiff where we spoke to a number of stakeholders, and one of them mentioned that a significant cost is the standing charge to fuel bills. Clearly 50p a day, 60p a day, regardless of what energy you've used. What's your view in terms of how that could be baked into a social tariff and how that could be helped to support?
So the standing charge, if you don't use much energy, the standing charge is really enormous. If you use lots of energy, for example, if you've got a health vulnerability, actually the standing charge is quite good value compared to the unit rate. So actually, you kind of need tariffs with and without standing charge, and the cheapest one for that customer is something, frankly, the supplier should be able to work out and put you on. So really, standing charges can be really bad for some people, but for a minority of people, they can be beneficial, and you should cater for both if you can.
We have said in the past about an obligation. We said in the past about an obligation on suppliers to move customers to the cheapest tariff that they have available, and that should be something that Ofgem could require of suppliers to do that. I think the unit rate approach is absolutely vital because, as we've said, if you've got high energy needs because of a health condition, then actually having that is important. On standing charges, there's so much in the standing charges which we could look at. Is the standing charge the best place for that? If we're talking about network, the investment in the networks and transmission, is paying for that, through the standing charge the best thing to do, or are the better approaches through investment or through general taxation that would then bring down the standing charge and bring down people's energy bills?
We've got a particular, so at the moment, I'm sure you're aware, but Ofgem are consulting, or just finished consulting, on whether or not they're going to allow customers to opt into a zero-rated standing charge. This was their great proposal after a year of thinking about this issue. One thing it doesn't do, sadly, is address the plight of households on prepayment meters that accrue these standing charges, irrespective of whether or not they're using any energy in the home at all. We sadly see, as an advice provider, households that have racked up £300, £400, £500 on the standing charge on gas in particular, because they haven't heated their home for months, if not years. That is an impossible situation for people, resulting in no hot water, no space heating. It's very, very, very difficult. We think that they should change the way that debt accrues on that standing, on that meter, to put it at the back of the meter, which means that it could be negotiated and spent down. Repaid without needing to be repaid in full, which is the case at the moment, which is staggering that we're applying that sort of Victorian approach to in the 21st century, to be frank.
Just turning in to support that energy companies could provide, such as the social tariff or similar schemes. Clearly, support for pensioners or vulnerable people has to be paid for by someone, either the state or energy companies, but someone's going to pay, bill payers. So I'm just thinking the most efficient way of delivering that could be directly through the energy companies. That would involve bill payers, other bill payers, paying more on their own bills to essentially subsidise that support. But it could be a less bureaucratic way of delivering support. What's your views on that?
They already do subsidise other bill payers, so there's about £18, I think, is the current price per customer per year for the bad debt allowance. It could be more than that now. So there's already a sort of degree of cross-subsidisation that already goes on. It's what that money's used for. At the moment, there's little transparency about those debt allowances and what they get spent on. If they were targeted in this way to say write off gas arrears for those customers and help them get back on supply, that would be a very good thing, and obviously have a wider social benefit which would more than offset the upfront cost that someone's got to pay, and I accept that someone would be paying.
So a tariff paid for by energy companies is a tariff paid for by consumers. So I will pay, let's just say, £20 on my bill to subsidise somebody who's fuel poor. That fuel poor person will also pay £20 from their bill to subsidise themselves. If it was paid for through taxation, I would be paying probably more than £20 and they would probably be paying nothing. Which is fairer? I would suggest the latter. Whether it's practical at the moment in the current environment, I don't know.
Would that latter approach be more bureaucratic and more costly actually to administer than the energy companies themselves delivering that support?
Well, if the energy companies do it themselves, then generally speaking, the energy consumers pay. The company passes on those costs through a price cap. So it's a question of how consumers pay and what's the fairest way of doing it. And I would suggest the fairness here might outweigh the bureaucracy.
You can have hybrids. So in the course of the energy crisis, obviously a lot of tax-funded support was provided to the energy companies that then administered the schemes on behalf of government. So you can have this sort of crossover, and that's something you might get to with a social tariff, for example.
I think just to kind of the warm home discount, for example, that is paid for by the bill payers. So sometimes when ministers say our warm home discount scheme, we are slightly annoyed. It's actually our warm home discount scheme that we're all paying for and we're all helping people with. So, so that approach does exist. But I think, just to add the point, and I will write to the committee on this, but to look at the kind of hybrid models where the wider energy industry, so network firms, transmission firms, market traders, also pay into that and make a contribution, given the amount of profits that they're making.
Just finally, I think Energy UK have suggested some proposals around those that use electric heating. And perhaps adjusting the levies and tariffs around that to support. Clearly that's an additional cost to them. Have you got any views on that?
I think one of the challenges, obviously, on electric heating, especially at the moment, is around the RTS switch off and the radio tele switch off. And I think all efforts around that should be focused on making sure that we're not in a situation on the 1st of July whereby consumers are left without hot water or heating because the RTS rollout hasn't been worked. So I think we need to, for those who are on, because people who are on electricity only, they do face often higher costs. That there is, again, in terms of when we're looking at housing type, heating type as well should come into that, because there are additional vulnerabilities for those who are on electric heating and the effectiveness of those heaters.
If you want to increase the amount of electric heating, I think what Energy UK is proposing can be a good measure. I would not necessarily conflate moving to electric heating and getting towards net zero with addressing fuel poverty. They are sometimes quite different things.
I think supporting households with the ongoing running costs for heat pump will be necessary, potentially by less if we do it effectively and we install those heat pumps effectively and we have high quality standards. Supporting those households which are electrically heated will also be really important in that debate. I'll let Ned talk about the virtue of his policy in a minute, but I would be nervous about just assuming that a current policy like the warm home discount scheme, even if it was doubled, would be sufficient to offset the impact of the distributional impact that such a sort of radical change might have. And we'll need to look carefully at the distributional impacts across all types of consumers, but particularly the most vulnerable.
Thank you. I'm going to allow Jo Baxter to ask a quick question.
Sorry, just a very quick follow-up, and thank you all for attending today. Just very interested in what you were saying there, Simon, about the RTS switch-off. Very concerned about that. I'm in a constituency with a huge number of constituents who are affected by that. I was just wondering if you could give us your view in terms of how that process is going. I've heard from a lot of constituents who have had difficulties in securing appointments to have their meters switched over.
Well, it's really, the process is doomed to failure. We are not going to see RTS switch off happen on the 1st of July. I mean, there's still going to be hundreds of thousands of RTS meters in people's homes on the date that it's saying that they're going to start winding down the signal. And we don't know what is going to happen. I think Peter might come in on this as well, but the risks that have been outlined are either your hot water and your heating are always on and you're going to be running up a massive bill, or it's always off. And even in the summer, that's going to be disastrous for people, especially pensioners and not having access to hot water. Or it's going to fix into a mode where it's going to start charging you at a higher rate. Mm-hmm. And again, that's going to be a real problem. And I don't think we've heard anything from industry about which of those is most likely. Indeed, it might be a combination of different factors in different areas. So it's really concerning, and we need the industry and Ofgem to present a crisis plan as to what is going to happen on the 1st of July to offset this challenge.
Thank you.
I'll just add to that I think at the moment, in many ways rightly, energy suppliers are a big focus of that because they're supposed to be replacing these meters, which can offset the impact. I think if you get to plan B and that crisis sort of plan that Simon mentions, you're going to need to bring different agents into that loop. And I think particularly the role that DNOs might have, district network operators might have in that context could be vital. They've got the experience of knowing who affected customers are because they've got the priority services register. They'd be able to tell you who the most affected customers would be. They've often got relationships with organisations like the Red Cross and others that can get meaningful levels of support out to people on the ground to offset crisis events like outages, so they would be very well placed to be able to sort of dial up that activity. Sadly, we've tried to prompt that conversation in both the department and in Ofgem, and it hasn't got very far. So I'm hoping that your interest and others will could dial that up a little bit, because I think it's needed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Amy and Egan.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to ask a question about to what extent energy companies have the data that they need to target pensioners. Now, based on the comments you've already put, it's not just energy companies, local authorities and energy networks were mentioned as well. Are there any others? And then where should they be getting data from? So we talked about HMRC, DWP, smart meters, potential of AI. Any more that we should add to either of those lists?
I think from my perspective, you've kind of covered the main basis here. Suppliers do have the potential to get a lot of useful information to help their customers through smart meters. Obviously, the smart meter rollout is not complete by quite a long way. But that can really help. It has to be tied in with data which really only the public sector can provide, and there needs to be effective gateways. Data security is always seen as an issue. There has to be found a way of allowing private sector actors sufficient access to sufficient data to help people, and that will be the key, I think.
As much as I've spoken about the virtue of automation and auto-enrolling people, I think you do need to provide some discretion locally for community-based organisations to be able to refer people into assistance, and for that be sort of accepted within the administrative regime, to know so that agency will know that person that's referred gets that support, because otherwise they're going to lose confidence in referring people in, and that's often what happens with some of the more unpredictable elements of energy support. But yeah, that local discretion for people to refer people in and not herd them towards a closed door is vital as well.
I think making sure that that's extended to GPs, health practitioners, social workers, and I think as well we can't as well sort of just the risk, but if you do that, is that all ends up at the door of the household support fund. And I know you've looked a lot at this, but I think one of the things about that is the household support fund needs to be made permanent. And annually, and it needs to be inflation linked, so it continues to rise in value in order for local authorities to support people properly. And also a realisation that fund has had to support a lot more people this winter, because it's it was in existence before the winter fuel payment cuts came in, and then more pensioners were having to rely on that. And I think one of there's a report recently been published by Children's Society and others around the future of the local welfare inquiry, and I think another thing that they suggest is that in order to make sure that there is a consistency across local areas as well, but there is some form of DWP-led audit and oversight of the household support fund, so we can make sure that it is being used to target those people who are most in need, and there is a consistency so that, you know, wherever you live in the country, you're going to be able to get a similar level of support.
Answer my next.
Oh, sorry.
What do we need to guard against? So you said data security, still need local discretion and the risks of everything landing on the household support fund. Anything else you'd add to that? To what extent would sharing information from priority services registers help?
Priority service registers are very good. They're very helpful. There is already sharing between water and energy on an increasing basis. Generally speaking, they are more on other non-financial vulnerabilities, so they can be helpful, but they're often not telling you so much about financial vulnerability. So making sure that you get information on financial vulnerability is going to be a key part of this.
Sorry, what scheme's this referring to? Sorry, is this just in general in terms of targeting future support? Oof, okay.
No, I mean, okay, clearly, the priority service register has a vital role to play, and I think we've sort of heard as well before about the fact that this needs to be shared across different utilities as well. But I think, as we've heard, we need to make sure that it's not just sort of a pure yes/no definition of vulnerability. There are often kind of grey areas, and ensuring that we can kind of capture that, and that also, I suppose the other thing to sort of think about in this context is that people's situations do change. Not everyone is always going to be in fuel poverty. Not everyone is always going to be low income. Not everyone's always going to have the same health condition. So just, we need to be able to make sure that it is able to reflect changing circumstances. And obviously, people move into those situations as well as move out.
I think the virtue of the PSR data is that link with the health conditions, and you will need to provide, in some instances, critical support to people to manage those health conditions, and the power outage or an inability to afford supply will result in, significant detriment, ill health, and possibly death. So not using that information seems absolutely crazy, and in some ways you'd be culpable. The way in which that needs to be done, though, exists institutionally. So we've got the priority services register; those flags can be shared. It's what support you're providing those people. What is it you're going to give them? Are you going to give them a big chunk off their energy bill? Are you going to give them energy efficiency measures? And those things at the moment aren't sufficient in scale or in terms of the sort of customer journey to guarantee that person will get something. So therefore, there's always going to be a trade-off with the Information Commission office about proportionality, whether or not you can guarantee to be able to provide a benefit for the use of that sensitive data. I think the final one that I would add to the list, coming back to your original question, was repeat hospital admission. We know that repeat hospital admission exists often because of poor housing standards, and either you want to get the landlord on the hook for sorting that out, or you want to be driving support that is available for owner-occupiers to the door of those individuals, and hopefully doing it on their behalf. Often this carousel of ill health is just very, very solvable, but it requires a focus, and that starts with the data in order to determine who those people are.
There are also multiple ways that the government is working on this space. If you look at fuel poverty in the round, you've got also Child Poverty Task Force, you've got Health and Energy Missions, you've got the MHCLG Opportunity Mission, working together across missions, having concerted winter plans involving the NHS and other key actors in there. It's key people work together. It's not just Priority Services Register, but it's the public sector as well working together.
Thank you so much. I've just got one small one, if I may. You were talking before about the proportion of fuel poor population. That the largest group were lone parents. I wondered what the proportion was for disabled people.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, we can write you on that.
Please, thank you very much. That concludes our questions to you. Thank you so much, Simon, Peter, Anthony. You really have. This has been a very, very good session. And we kept to time in spite of
Miracle.
So, even better. So thank you very much.
Thank you very
Come
much.
again.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Order. Order. And welcome back to the Pensioner Poverty Inquiry. And we're delighted to welcome Ned Hammond from Energy UK. Ned, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you for having me. So I'm Ned Hammond. I'm the Deputy Director on the Customer Policy team at Energy UK. So Energy UK as a whole is the trade association that covers the entire energy system. So we work with suppliers right the way through to generation. And my role focuses on everything that's customer facing, so that includes energy supply as well as support schemes and also heat decarbonisation as well.
Thank you. So I understand that Energy UK have said that 40% of customers are struggling to afford their energy bills currently. Do you have the figures that relate specifically to pensioners on that?
We don't have figures ourselves specifically on pensioners, but there is data from other organisations that shows that. So if you look at sort of government statistics on fuel poverty, those over the age of 60 are broadly in line with overall households to be in fuel poverty, around 11%, and have a similar average fuel poverty gap as well, at around £400 on those government statistics. And then if we look at some recent data from Ofgem surveys, that's suggested that 36% of pensioner age households are struggling with their energy bills, and around 1% are behind on the bills. That is a significant proportion, although it's lower than the sort of age groups that are struggling the most. Younger age groups between 16 and 35, where you have around sort of 2/3 struggling, and over 10% that are behind on their bills. That's obviously self-reported data though, so that may there may be an impact of the way that different age groups respond to surveys as well.
What's the implications then with so many, with such a large proportion of consumers struggling to around their their heating costs?
Well, we're seeing sort of significant implications of that over the last few years. It's come from the sort of energy crisis and then continued beyond that. So we've seen energy debt increasing considerably over the last few years. That's risen from less than £2 billion before the energy crisis to now nearly £4 billion. Those that are in energy debt and have a sort of payment plan are typically in around, on average, about £900. Those that are in arrears and don't have a payment plan yet have over £2,000 of debt on average. And there's sort of 2.3 million households in total that are in debt or arrears. So it's really significant. And as mentioned previously, the impact of that is that cost has to be socialised across everyone's energy bills. So ultimately means that all of our energy bills are higher as well as those people that are in debt really struggling. And there's obviously a high correlation between the people that are in debt and the people that are in fuel poverty. Okay.
The government is aiming to reduce bills by £300 by 2030. Obviously, £300 a year. But you're saying that this is largely dependent on international gas prices. So how will that be offset, for example, by energy efficiency measures that the government is bringing in?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, the government has made a commitment to reduce energy bills by £300 a year by 2030. They also have the Clean Power 2030 mission to get to a largely decarbonised electricity system by the end of the decade. It's important to say that we believe that clean power will ultimately lead to lower bills, but that is likely to drive down bills in the 2030s rather than over the next few years. So we really need to see policies that will be more proactively reducing bills in the immediate term. As things stand, there haven't been any policies that have been formally announced that are actually going to actively do that. We know that the Warm Homes Plan, which is looking to improve energy efficiency and invest in low carbon technologies, is forthcoming, and we'll see what that looks like. That potentially could have a significant impact over the next few years. But we also released a report in March which had 10 different measures, including that one, to cut bills for households and businesses. And we think implementing those policies could go a long way to achieving that £300 target. If you weren't to do any of those things, then the gas price would continue to set the wholesale price for most of the time, and therefore we would continue to be highly dependent on what happens with gas prices. You might have a situation where the wholesale gas market tumbles and you get lucky and the bills come down, but I don't think that we should rely on that.
So, the Committee on Fuel Poverty, you probably heard the earlier session, said that targeted report will remain important and necessary for the foreseeable future. What would change, would change this assessment?
Well, I suppose there's a few ways of looking at that, but largely what you need to do is get to remove the kind of debt stock that is in the market, and then also get to a point where bills are more affordable for people. So implementing our suggestions to cut energy bills could help to do that. You need to get to a point where bills can be affordable for everyone, and then also need to reduce the debt from around £4 billion at the moment. There are a few measures in place that will help to do that now, so or being looked at. So Ofgem is looking at a debt relief scheme that it's aiming to implement later this year. That potentially could have an impact, although we have some concerns about some of the sort of options that have been looked at in terms of the structure of that. So we would like to see that scheme focus in the immediate term on writing off some of the debt that's in the market at the moment, and then look at some longer term options around debt matching and having households that are struggling with their bills on repayment plans, and then that being supported by the suppliers matching those repayments. But we think that second part is a bit more complicated to design and therefore should come later. And we also need to deal with the stock of debt that's in the market, as well as the kind of like flow of that increasing. So dealing with that stock could be helped by doing automated debt write-off as well. So that would be helpful. We're not going to get to a point where we can't have any sort of targeted support at all in the near term. It would need, those targeted support schemes would need to have their impact to then start to look at a point where you could potentially remove that. But as was mentioned earlier, the existing targeted support schemes are not enough. They don't cover the fuel poverty gap. And until they start to do that more significantly, you're going to end up in a situation where fuel poverty remains and energy debt continues to increase.
So what would you say in terms of, again, as we heard in the previous panel about both DWP but also energy companies providing that support through a social tariff? What are your views there?
Yeah, sure. So a social tariff means quite different things to different people, so it depends on how you look at it. At Energy UK, we think that what is really important to deliver is a new long-term targeted support scheme that replaces the existing warm home discount. And we think there are basically like 5 key principles to that. The first of those is better targeting. So it was mentioned a bit previously, but we would like to see a move towards a combination of income, health and energy use data to be the primary ways at which you would use that scheme, with things like means tested benefits as sort of secondary supports to that. We also think there should be tiered support. So again, as mentioned previously, but at the moment, most of the support schemes are a flat rate. You either get it or you don't. We would like to see, by using things like income and health data, you'll be more easily able to target those that sort of need higher levels of support and some that need some support but not as much. Also think it would be helpful if the support was variable. So at the moment, energy bills are considerably higher than they were pre-crisis, and therefore, as was mentioned previously, the warm home discount at only a marginally higher level than it used to be is nowhere near enough. But if we were in a situation where energy bills were much lower, clearly the amount of support would not be as significant. You could also do that in a way where more people would come into the scheme as energy bills rose, because they would then become eligible. So this would also help to avoid the situation we saw in the energy crisis, where a significant amount of universal support was provided and was very, very costly. At the moment, where energy bills are right now, we need large scale. The warm home discount is around sort of £500 million a year. With the expansion that's planned, it's going to go up to around £800 million a year. But across the country as a whole, on government statistics, the fuel poverty gap is £1.5 billion, and on other people's numbers, it's even higher. So it needs to be big enough to deal with that. And then the final principle that we think is important is that it's progressive. At the moment, the warm home discount is on customers' energy bills. It's also part of the standing charge, which was mentioned previously. So it's particularly challenging. If you were to move that into government spending, we think that would be a more progressive way of dealing with that. So those are the principles that we think are important. The one other thing I would mention around this is that there's a scheme that was run in the Netherlands called the Temporary Emergency Energy Fund, which has a lot of these principles. I think that's a very interesting potential model to have a look at. I would be happy to sort of like follow up with more details of that, if that would be helpful.
Thank you. Temporary, though, is it?
It was a temporary scheme during the crisis, but we think the principles of it could be used for a permanent scheme.
Lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, an actual social tariff in the market. Yeah. We would have sort of more concerns about. I think it depends on the exact model you looked at, but we think sort of any of those models could potentially sort of distort the market and might also discourage customers from engaging with their suppliers and potentially getting benefits of the actual tariffs that are available to them.
Understood. So it's more the language.
Yeah,
Thank
exactly,
you very much. John Milne.
Thank you, Chair. You'll have heard in the previous panel we were talking about winter fuel payment reduction in access. What assessment has the energy industry made of this? And, for example, do you know how many pensioners in fuel poverty are now missing out?
Yeah, so We haven't done any more assessments than people who were on previously, so I would sort of revert to their numbers for that. And obviously, the government did an impact assessment on what they thought would be the sort of outcomes from the change. What we have seen is that there's clearly been a big reduction in the number of people who are able to access it, and a small proportion of those are people who would be eligible for pension credit but are not accessing it. So at the time of the announcement, I think it was around 880,000 pensioners who were eligible for pension credit were not accessing it, and therefore were not able to get the winter fuel payment. Those people are more likely to be the people who potentially be in fuel poverty. Clearly, we've seen a bit of progress on that over the last 6 to 9 months, but as was mentioned earlier, there's going to need to be continued efforts put into that to get as many people who are eligible for pension credit to be sign up for it as possible, given that so many of these schemes are now dependent on being on taking up that benefit. Obviously winter fuel payment, but also warm home discount and the cold weather payments as well.
Yes, and what steps so far have industry providers taken to identify and support target support at people?
So at Energy UK, we run something called the Vulnerability Commitment. This is a commitment that 13 energy suppliers that account for about 95% of households are signed up to, and that is run in conjunction with consumer groups and charities, and also DESNZ and Ofgem are also involved in it as well. And that looks at various themes each year. Last year, one of the key themes was identifying and supporting vulnerable households, improving efforts to do that. So some of the key things that were looked at were combining internal data that suppliers have on their customers with behaviour signals. So things like regularly going off supply or missing payments, and also increasing training for staff to sort of better recognise customers. Suppliers do have, in some cases, a reasonable amount of data on customers, and smart meters are helping to improve that. But a lot of it is dependent on customers engaging with suppliers. So we would like to see legislative change come through that would enable new data points to be available in the right ways, but also some of the sort of use cases potentially to expand as well, to enable suppliers to be able to use potential vulnerability indicators to do things like populate their priority services register and things like that. We are part of a data sharing working group that is led by DWP, chaired by Minister Farnborough. Led by DESNZ. DWP are part of it at the moment as well, and also trying to work with other departments such as HMRC and the Department of Health to try and access more data in the future. But that's more of a sort of like longer term aim. In the near term, the focus is on clarifying what suppliers are able to use data for in order to provide support to low-income and vulnerable customers.
You slightly anticipated my next question there. So in terms of being able to access DWP data, has that been easy? Can it be improved?
So the Digital Economy Act does provide for some of that. And I'm not a legal expert, so you'll get to the extent of my expertise fairly soon. But through the warm home discount, particularly now that there's the expanded warm home discount coming in, that means that the main means tested benefits will mean people are able to get warm home discount. That data matching can then go through to suppliers, and they are then able to use that in certain ways depending on what type of warm home discount eligibility it is. So if it's the DWP means tested benefits data, they then be able to use that for a sort of separate element of warm home discount called industry initiatives, which basically allows suppliers, often through third parties, to provide additional benefits like might be debt relief or energy efficiency measures or financial assistance. But what it can't be used for at the moment is to combine it with suppliers' own data to help sort of populate their priority services register. So we think things like that could potentially be helpful in the future. Interestingly, the sort of like pensions data that is made available is based on different legislation, and therefore slightly wider uses are available. But I can follow up with more detail on that because it might be helpful to go through it in writing. Might be a bit more easy.
Thank you. And then one final point. What steps do you think are needed, and by who, to address the pension credit clip edge, which we've talked about a lot as well, which is a really big issue where just a few pounds over the threshold and you miss out not on just on winter fuel but all the other passported benefits?
Yeah, so I guess there's a few different steps to take here. The first one is, of course, getting as many people who are eligible to sign up to pension credit as possible. Clearly, the government has started a lot of work on this, and more can be done, and working with consumer groups and charities is really important. Then there could be what the government does to look at the threshold of pension credit at the moment, and whether that should potentially change, or whether there's additional thresholds to add that would provide, not necessarily provide ongoing support, but would make them eligible for a smaller element of things like winter fuel payment. Longer term, I think that the principles that I mentioned around long-term targeted support would help to do that. So if you moved from a system that is focusing on using means-tested benefits, which are a very sort of like helpful proxy for what we have at the moment, but are, as you say, you're either sort of in them or out of them. If you move to a system that is focused on using data around income and health, and in the case of energy consumption, then that provides a lot more flexibility to provide the level of support that people need. Now, there's a lot of challenges to be able to do that. That is a long-term project, but if we could get to that point, I think you would have far more households receiving the level of support that they need.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I just follow up on in terms of what you were saying about the legislation that you would need to enable there to be more data sharing? What specifically had you in mind?
So some of it can be achieved, and again, you will get to the level of my expertise fairly quickly, but some of it can be achieved through secondary legislation changes to the Digital Economy Act. Okay. So at the moment that specifies certain parts of data that can be used, and also the use cases for it as well. So those could be added into the Digital Economy Act in order to make that data in some form of way shared or matched to suppliers. Our preferred model is to have a sort of third-party organisation that sort of receives and processes the data and then just basically puts it into an indicator for suppliers. So then you can kind of like work around sort of data security and privacy concerns. Then there may be more sort of significant legislation, primary legislation that might be required for bigger changes to the way that sort of data is shared and matched with the energy industry. If it may be that some types of data like income may need that sort of like primary legislation rather than just changes to the existing legislation.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Peter Bedford.
Thank you, Chair. Earlier we touched on the social tariff. I think you touched on that briefly earlier about your kind of reluctance to go down that route because of the impact on the market. Do you recognise the advantage, though, of having a social tariff for vulnerable customers? And just what you could elaborate a bit further on.
Yeah, absolutely. And we want to see the support that low-income vulnerable customers need. And it is right that there is protection in the market for vulnerable customers that are not necessarily able to engage with their suppliers particularly well. So this is one of the reasons why the data sharing and matching needs to improve, so that suppliers are able to get the data they need on vulnerable customers when they don't engage. But also as we move to the energy market in the retail market is evolving quite a lot at the moment. So as more people are getting low carbon technologies, there is more opportunity for them to shift their energy demand to different times of day. For example, if you have an electric vehicle, if you have a smart tariff with one of the suppliers, you plug it in at night, you need it ready by a certain time of day, but it doesn't matter when that electricity goes into the car. So it goes in at points when the price is cheapest because demand is very low and supply is high. Vulnerable customers may struggle more than other customers to be able to access some of those opportunities, even if they have some of those products. So let's say through a supplier or a government energy efficiency scheme, they have a heat pump put in, or they have solar and batteries put in. So they may have those products, but may not be able to access them as well. It's really important that we try as hard as possible to help those customers to be able to benefit from those. But where they can't, you need to have the sort of protection in the market to make sure that they are not hurt by that. At the moment, we have a price cap in place. at the moment, a very large number of customers are on this, but the idea of it is that it is a default backstop tariff that provides protection to customers who are not able to engage in the market. So we think that a combination of that and a proper long-term targeted support scheme is the thing that can provide the level of protection that's needed for those vulnerable customers. We think that if you introduced, and again, it depends on the model, a specific tariff in the market, you would potentially sort of, for some, low-income customers that might automatically go onto that but are not vulnerable, they might miss out on all those benefits of the new flexible market. But also, you would potentially have distorting impacts on the market as a whole. So one of the types of social tariff that's being looked at is a rising block tariff where the price of energy gets higher the more energy you use. But a lot of vulnerable customers are customers that have very high energy needs because of medical requirements or things like that. So if you implemented that, you would need to put in a huge number of exemptions and trying to kind of like revert that. We think that would be too complicated, and it would be better to use the existing model of energy rebates, and there's potential to evolve how those rebates are provided. There are some suppliers already who provide them in chunks through the winter rather than in one-off to help people manage their payments. Rather than a system where you've actually got tariffs in the market that are sort of distorting what we want. We want overall to be a competitive and innovative retail market.
It's that. I mean, we touched on earlier the standing charge issue in terms of it's a flat fee per day. Often those older people or those in high energy use, that it would disproportionately affect them, given that they might not be using as much energy. What's your thoughts on that in terms of how either a social tariff or of a framework could be improved to account for that anomaly?
There's like pros and cons to the standing charge, and there's no sort of like easy answer to the best thing to do with it. The Ofgem did a large review a couple of years ago that led to a significant increase in the amount of network costs that go onto the standing charge, so they now play a bigger role than they did previously. And then there's a large amount of fixed costs that are then recovered through the standing charge, and if you were to move those around, you would have distributional consequences. Ofgem did a review last year looking at sort of trying to move some of the standing charge onto the unit rate and decided against it because they were worried that some low-income and vulnerable customers would see significant increases in their bills. So it's not an easy one to do. Now, the easiest thing to do, albeit it would take some public spending, would be to take the warm home discount and what we would like to become the long-term targeted support scheme and move that into government spending, because then you're just taking something out of the standing charge and then it doesn't go into something else. So it would just reduce the standing charge without having to worry about people's unit rates. But outside of those things, it needs sort of serious analysis to determine what is the best thing to do with things that are currently in the standing charge and whether it's better to have them in the unit rate or not. And there are, when Ofgem first proposed the zero standing charge price cap option, there was quite a bit of media coverage that suggested people would suddenly just have £300 off their bills. But that's just not what would happen in reality. It would move to the unit rate. Some people would have significantly higher bills, so just need to think about those consequences.
Yep. And in terms of what you believe government should be prioritising in the run-up to winter coming this year, what do you think would be the best mechanisms to support those that are in fuel poverty?
Yeah, absolutely. So the government announced or consulted on it, and we hope they go ahead with this sort of expansion of the warm home discount, which means that the people in the sort of second group will receive warm home discount whether they have sort of like whether they meet the high cost heat threshold or not. We're supportive of that expansion, but we think that one of the things that could have been done would have been to sort of like tier those payments so that the people who do have high cost heat got a higher amount energy rebate than the people who are now coming into the scheme, but they could have potentially had a sort of smaller payment given that they don't meet that other threshold. Otherwise, things that can be done ahead of winter is the sort of, the data sharing working group that I mentioned, the data science-led one that we're involved in, making sure that suppliers are making the most of the data that they do have available to them to identify and provide support to vulnerable customers. And then we think it's really important that the Ofgem debt relief scheme that's been proposed comes in as soon as possible in a way that can provide automated support to customers that are in energy debt and need the support the most. As I say, we would like to see that provide debt write-off in the near term and then move to sort of debt matching in the long term once that can be designed properly.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And now we go to Joe Baxter.
Thank you. I think you've answered most of my questions already, but it's really interesting what you were saying about the data sharing working group. To what extent will sharing that data enable different utilities companies to target support?
Yeah, so I mean, it really depends on kind of like where it evolves to in the future. But if we think about the immediate term, what it really is enabling is a clarification of how suppliers can target their customers. So it's really making suppliers more comfortable that they can use some of that data to identify the customers that will need that support, and that can then be the various different measures that I mentioned. So it might be debt kind of things, it might be financial assistance, it might be energy advice through National Energy Action, it might be energy efficiency measures. And then, sorry, I lost my track of thought. So could you just repeat the question, sorry?
Yeah, so it was just about to what extent sharing that information will enable suppliers to target support.
And the thing longer term is then the sort of potentially bigger opportunity here. So this will take up potentially a lot of work, but if you can move to a system where more types of data are shared in different ways, then that can lead to better targeting of support. So in terms of the sort of long-term targeted support scheme, that would be moving from a system where we're currently using means tested benefits as a sort of proxy for customers that need support the most, which is good but not perfect, to a system where we're using income and health and energy consumption data for that. Again, the sort of that would give an indicator to those suppliers of people that are receiving that support scheme, and that would be a very good indicator to those suppliers that those are the customers that would need sort of additional support potentially as well. And if we had the sort of tiered thresholds in place, you could see which ones need them most. Then if you expanded the ways in which suppliers can use that, it could provide sort of more opportunities. So at the moment, that's done through sort of certain existing schemes that suppliers can find those customers. If you widen that to suppliers just identifying customers in general and also populating their priority services register, that would mean that they would have more customers that they're ready to provide support to when they need it, but could also widen the net of customers that may need support that can get the things like the energy efficiency measures and debt relief.
And are there any unintended consequences that we might need to be aware of in terms of that data sharing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so obviously, anything that involves more data sharing and it leads to sort of data security and data privacy concerns. So there's various different sort of like models through which you could potentially do that, but we think that a model where there is a sort of third-party organisation that processes the data and puts it into the format that is needed, and then basically sends an indicator to a supplier that would say they're eligible for this type of support, would then provide the suppliers what they need to support those customers. So the suppliers wouldn't have the sort of like information on the sort of like the actual income or the actual health concerns that health issues that the customer has. They would just know that they sort of fit into an overall group of people that need a certain type of support. Clearly you would need to put the right sort of like regulatory frameworks and things in place for the organisation that was doing that. But there are examples of some sort of work that's being done at the moment. So an organisation, Smart Data Communications Company, which runs the sort of like smart system, has been doing trials of suppliers sharing anonymised smart meter data to them to be able to start doing some of this sort of stuff effectively. So they could be a potential company that could do some of this work.
And just whilst I've got you, and tell me if it's not your area, but just on the RTS switchover, I'm just wondering if you had views on that process and what else government could or should be doing to make sure that people are not left in a position where, as outlined in the previous panel, either people's heating was always on or always off, and running up big bills.
Yeah, certainly. I'm the right person, whether that's a good thing or not. So, look, there's a lot of work to do here. Still, there is a lot of progress being made. Suppliers have really ramped up the initiatives to engage customers and get more replacements done over the course of the last year. We're now at over 1,000 replacements a day, and some of the really challenging kind of like technical barriers to be able to give customers replacement meters have been overcome. So you mentioned earlier some customers struggling to get appointments. Suppliers are, firstly, they've now got a sort of solution for every customer, so it may not have been the case historically. They're also massively increasing their engineering capacity in some of the harder to reach areas. So if customers have had that problem previously, suppliers may well be getting in touch with them now, but also please ask your constituents to get in touch with their suppliers again. While the replacement rate has increased a lot, it's clearly not at the point that it would need to get down to 0 customers by the end of June. We're working incredibly hard as an industry with Ofgem and with DESNZ on a carefully managed phase-out plan to ensure that we can replace all the RTS meters over time and minimise any of those impacts on customers. We're very focused on vulnerable customers in these circumstances in particular as well, to make sure that we are as much as possible trying to engage with them through different methods to help them through that, and also be ready to provide them any support if there are any of those issues that you mentioned. We are, as I say, working very hard on that plan at the moment, and we'll have it in place in time for the end of June.
Thank you, and I'll take your contact details afterwards.
Steve Darling just has a quick question for you.
We talked a lot about data sharing. Any partnership working with GP practices with things like rollout of vaccinations like the fuel or COVID, and using that as an opportunity to identify vulnerable people who particularly need support?
Within the sort of data sharing work, I think one of the things that we have suggested, and this is sort of very early stage, so not saying that it will definitely get to that point, but as a longer term opportunity, is to potentially look at a kind of like social prescribing in some form that would where GPs would be able to prescribe that people get sort of rebates on their energy bills because of health issues that they have. I think one of the really important things once we get into if we can get into a sort of data world where the sharing and matching is working better, is also how quickly we're updating that data as well, because people's circumstances can change a lot, and they may not be eligible for support one day, but the next month they might well be. We think that the sort of GP route with those prescriptions could be a way of doing that quickly. Yeah,
that's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. And that concludes the questions that we have for you, Ned. Order, order.